This video contains spoilers of events from the original Final Fantasy VII. So, a couple of months ago, Naoki Hamaguchi teased some gameplay elements regarding the Highwind in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. He said,
There's another aspect of the gameplay you'll be able to access from the Highwind. Do something new and special while you're riding around on it.
Kitase followed that up with,
I think I can tell you now, what he's got in store for the Highwind will blow you away. It will beat any expectation you have in your head right now. It's going to be even better than that.
Boy, they're really excited about what they have planned for Part 3. They're just chomping at the bit to tell us, but they know they can't. What exactly do they have planned for the Highwind in Part 3? What is Hamaguchi referring to that Kitase is saying will completely blow our collective minds in regards to how the Highwind works? You'll have to hear me out, because I think I have some interesting ideas, and I think it connects to some other things that I think will play a factor in Part 3, such as aerial combat, the weapons, submarine travel, and even a little interesting nugget about the ending to the original Final Fantasy VII. So naturally, a big focus in Part 3 will inevitably be about the weapons. Now, they've already introduced us to weapons in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We got to see them at Mount Corel, and even in Gungaga. But if you've played the original Final Fantasy VII, you know that these weapons aren't the real weapons that I'm talking about. They were just teasing us for the real granddaddy weapons, which are probably the thing that gets me the most excited about in Part 3. Not just because they're going to be fucking massive and badass and will likely consist of multiple parts of a boss fight on a scale we have yet to see, but also because, if you recall, there were two weapons that were never integrated as part of the story. I'm talking about Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon. Initially, these weapons weren't even part of the game in Japan. They were added in the international versions that we received in the West as optional boss fights. Japanese gamers didn't get to experience these fights until it released on PC there. This is one of the big benefits of splitting this remake into multiple parts is that, and I think this is a pretty safe bet, is that they will be able to fully integrate Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon into the main story this time, instead of just being optional boss fights. But anyway, the main point is that there's going to be some big-ass fights against these big-ass creatures. So the question is, how will these fights work, and will there be new mechanics surrounding them? And in my personal opinion, yes. So, naturally you'll fight them on the ground to some degree, like occasionally swinging at individual body parts. If you're elevated, you might tackle them by striking their arms or hands when they swing at you or their feet on the ground. But I imagine they're going to take things even further by adding some miniaturized versions of themselves, something like Sin Spawn from Final Fantasy X. But that's not all, and this is where the new mechanics come in. And yes, I'm going to be speculating quite a bit here, so buckle up. I think there's going to be airship combat itself and aerial combat, like actual aerial combat with your characters. We'll get to airships in a bit, but first, let's talk about aerial combat. Now, I've done a video on aerial combat in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth before it even came out, saying it would be slightly improved, but won't be crazy like Kingdom Hearts or even other action games. And I still don't think they'll make that kind of improvement with the aerial combat in Part 3 per se. I do think they could do something else though. Remember in Advent Children when Cloud gets lifted by all of his friends to tackle Bahamut way up in the sky? Yeah, I know. It was a bit cheesy. But I think they might try to integrate something similar to this concept in Part 3. I think they could make a system work where, using those synergy pips, an ally can launch a character into the air. When this occurs, it would go into a separate isolated gameplay mode where the character goes airborne with their own unique playstyle. This could be an effective strategy when trying to combat the granddaddy weapons in order to reach body parts that would otherwise be out of reach. It would also be useful to be able to fight enemies on the deck of the airship. Like Ultimate Weapon. By making it an isolated mode, they won't have to compromise the balance of each character's unique abilities. It can also be used in boss fights. Imagine you're fighting Reno, and during the fight he targets Tifa. He could use an ability on her that would launch her into the air, then the game would transition to an isolated fight with him one-on-one with Tifa for a limited amount of time. And maybe you have to fulfill a certain requirement, otherwise he will cause a devastating finishing blow to her before returning back to the ground. Another instance I see aerial combat being used is the final battle. Remember this scene before you fight Bizarro Sephiroth where all the characters are floating around? Or now he's known as Sephiroth Reborn, which is likely just a localization change. Yeah, something tells me that the first part of the final battle in part 3 is going to be Sephiroth dueling with each of the characters one-on-one in aerial combat before transitioning to the next part. Airship combat, on the other hand, almost seems inevitable. Well, let's take a step back and just recognize that for starters, they basically confirmed that the Highwind was going to be a big part of Part 3 before Rebirth even came out, which is the hint that there's gotta be even more to it than just exploration then. Otherwise, they would have waited until closer to Part 3's release to reveal that information. In going back to Naoki Hamaguchi's statement, there's another aspect of the gameplay that you'll be able to access from the Highwind and do something new and special while you're riding around on it. And he said this so far from release, which means let me be honest, just being able to fully explore the world would already be amazing by itself. Like, we already know that the entire world is seamless, so it's already bonkers that we're going to be able to explore even more of the world while riding around on an airship without loading between different areas in a seamless fashion. So it's even more crazy that there are more features to the airship than that. But in hindsight, it's not as crazy as you think. I often say that Rebirth acts as a huge tease for what's coming in Part 3. And right in the beginning of Rebirth, they're teasing airship combat. When you exit Calm for the first time, and you see all these fucking Relnicas flying around in the air, they were teasing us not just with airship traversal for Part 3, but that you're going to be flying with these Relnicas simultaneously. So inevitably you're going to be engaging in some combat with them, right? I mean, why else would you be flying around the world with them? They're certainly not going to be friendly to you, that's for sure. But there's another reason that airship travel is going to play a large role in this game, and that's due to the weapon fights. These weapons are so massive that Cloud and gang aren't going to be able to fight them alone. I mean, I imagine that we're going to be flying around the Corel Desert in the Highwind, shooting Ruby Weapon in the face, all the while the other half of our party is going to be on the ground beating up its tentacles. But remember, Kitase said, it will beat any expectation you have in your head right now. It will be even better than that. So what more could they do to elevate the Highwind's capabilities beyond just airship combat? Well, this is more speculation on my part, but I think it's going to be more complex than just feeling like a minigame. I think that your party members are going to play a more significant role, such as maybe designating them to different parts of the ship. Like, maybe you get to assign a character to piloting and different character to controlling the guns and weaponry or some such. And then each character will have their own unique capabilities in some way. And this actually makes a lot of sense considering how many characters we'll have access to in Part 3. And if you want access to all my videos, you should consider subscribing to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on more Final Fantasy videos. Just saying, we'll have access to Cloud, Barret, Tifa, no Aerith, although she might come back for a time. I talk about that more in my ending video to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Red 13, Yuffie, Cait Sith, Vincent, and Cid. That's a total of 8 characters. Now, of course, that's the same as the original game had, but one of the problems with older JRPGs in general is that as you continue to accrue new party members, it's hard to justify using most of them. Like, most people just end up sticking to 3 characters and fuck all the rest, because it's just easier to manage, and also because it will require extra grinding if you do try to use them all, as they don't acquire experience points while not in use. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth found a way to alleviate this problem by either forcing the party to split up during dungeons and or alternating which characters were required in specific chapters of the game. They were fairly evenly spread out so that you were forced to use them all in some capacity throughout the game. And so, now that you will have access to the Highwind, they will be able to take this concept further by allowing you to split your party up between members on the ground and members in your airship. I imagine it being reminiscent of how Final Fantasy VI often lets you split your party up into teams. And naturally, what will tie communication between the two parties? Well, PHS of course, which surprisingly wasn't utilized as much as I thought it might have been used in Rebirth, but I think it will be utilized even deeper in Part 3. And of course, Chadley will play a role in getting you hooked up, which more on him later. And Airship Combat won't just be reserved for the air, but also the sea. Don't forget that the original Final Fantasy VII also featured a submarine that allowed you to travel underneath the sea, and this time, you'll likely fight Emerald Weapon as part of the main story from your submarine. The original game did have a submarine minigame, and hopefully that's one of the pieces of content that doesn't come back. That jank-ass shit can go fuck itself right into and is just replaced by submarine combat. And I imagine that the controls and mechanics will be similar to Airship Combat, but with some variants. The question though is, will it actually be a submarine this time? I'm thinking that they might change the game so that the Highwind itself just transforms into a submarine for convenience sake. This isn't actually as crazy as you might think. In fact, the Highwind transforming is actually a part of the original Final Fantasy VII. You see this part in the ending? The Highwind actually transforms into a new airship that resembles more closely to what it looks like in Advent Children in Dirge of Cerberus. Unfortunately, you never really get to use that Highwind while in this state during the course of the game, which was a bit of a bummer, but the concept of it transforming isn't as unlikely as you might suspect given it was done before. And so the second question is, will this version of the Highwind actually be usable in the game? And I would say probably. I think it will evolve, so to speak, close to the final dungeon into this state, and along with it, the technology will dramatically improve. Once you've fully explored the world, you'll be able to use it to communicate with people using some kind of PHS network or something which Chadley will likely be involved with. Hell, Chadley will probably just upload his entire being into the airship itself, and will just become the mind of the airship itself that speaks to you. It'll be like ChatGPT, but Chadley bot? Chadbot? We totally need a Chadbot. And every time you log into it, you'll be greeted with this.
I hope you won't mind my mentioning, but I've observed that World Intel Collection is stalled of late. That World Intel Collection is stalled of late. That World Intel Collection is stalled of late.
In short, I think that the Highwind will play such a large role in the game that it will go through various iterations throughout the game, culminating in this version of the ship seen in the ending to Final Fantasy VII. And speaking of endings, you should check out my video that's all about the ending to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth right here.